Pin it again. Are your hands made of wood? Lady Isadora Crane's voice cracked across the great hall of Holloway Court like a whip. She spun in front of the tall mirror, ivory silk twisted at her waist, her face red with fury. 3 maids stood frozen by the wall. A footman looked at his shoes. The seamstress knelt at the hem, a mouth full of pins, and said nothing. "Do you hear me? I asked you a question." Isadora grabbed a fistful of the seamstress's hair and yanked her head back. Someone gasped near the doorway. The seamstress did not cry out. She simply reached up, calm as still water, and began to pin the lace again, her fingers steady as a surgeon's, and then, so softly it was almost a breath, she began to hum. 4 note thens, 4 more, a lullaby. Duke Lucian Holloway had been walking past the doorway with a letter in his hand. He stopped as if a bullet had struck him. The letter fell to the floor. His face went the color of the marble beneath his boots. That song did not exist on any sheet of paper in England. He had never sung it aloud to a living soul. His wife had hummed it to him once, in the dark, 2 years before she burned to death in the West Wing fire. "Where?" he said, and his voice did not sound like his own. "Did you learn that song?" The seamstress lifted her eyes to him for the first time. Gray eyes, calm eyes. "A lady taught me, Your Grace," she said. "She is dead now." Her sleeve slipped as she reached for another pin. On the pale skin of her right forearm, a scar shaped like a fern leaf caught the candlelight before she pulled the fabric back down. Nobody in that room understood yet what they had just watched. But before the month was finished, this house would burn a second time. Not with fire, but with truth. And every soul standing in that hall tonight would remember exactly where they were standing when it started. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. 2 years earlier, Holloway Court had been a house of laughter. Verena Holloway, 27 years old, had married the Duke for love, not land, and the whole county had whispered about it with jealousy dressed as concern. She was too plain for a duke, they said, too quiet, too fond of walking alone in the kitchen gardens instead of riding to hounds. But Lucian had loved her the way a starving man loves bread, simply, completely, without needing to explain it to anyone. Then came the fire. The West Wing, the night of the harvest ball, smoke pouring black against the stars, while guests screamed on the lawn. They found a body in the ashes of the Duchess's private study, burned beyond any face a person could recognize, wearing a ring everyone knew was hers. The county buried Verena Holloway in the Holloway family vault with more flowers than the church could hold. Lucian did not weep at the funeral. He simply stopped speaking for 6 weeks. Servants said he walked the gardens at 2 a.m, calling her name into the dark, like a man calling down a well with no bottom. For a full year he refused every invitation, every hunt, every dinner the county tried to tempt him with, until his own mother wrote from London begging him to remember he still had a duty to the title, if not to himself. It was only in the 2nd year, worn thin by loneliness, and pressed on every side by relatives who needed an heir and a house that needed a mistress, that Lucian had allowed himself to be introduced to Lady Isadora Crane at a house party in Harrogate, and had mistaken her bright, easy laughter for the sound of a life beginning again, when in truth it was only the sound of a woman who had learned exactly what a grieving duke wanted to hear. The county, watching the courtship unfold over that autumn and winter, split neatly down the middle over it, half of them relieved to see him smiling again at any cost, half of them murmuring behind gloved hands that Lady Isadora Crane had set her sights on Holloway Court within a week of the old Duchess's memorial service being mentioned in the London papers, and had simply waited a decent interval before making her approach. It was into that uneasy, half-healed house, still thick with a grief its master would not name aloud, that the quiet new seamstress arrived one gray afternoon in November, with a single trunk, a work basket, and a secret sewn into the lining of both. What no one in that grieving crowd knew was that the woman in the ashes was not Verena Holloway. It was a maid named Grace Tolliver, who had gone into the study that night to fetch a shawl and never come out. Verena herself had been 3 miles away, hidden in a gamekeeper's cottage, her arm burned raw from pulling ledgers out of a fire someone else had set, her mind screaming one single fact over and over. Someone in this house wanted her dead, and they had killed the wrong woman to do it. The steward, Mr. Silas Grieve, had run Holloway Court's accounts for 22 years. He was a careful man, a quiet man, the kind of man nobody ever suspected, because he cleaned his spectacles before every sentence, as if wiping away his own fingerprints. For 6 years, he had been bleeding money from the estate, false repairs, invented tenants, ghost wages for servants who did not exist, £31,000, siphoned pound by pound into an account under a false name in Leeds. Verena had found the pattern by accident, doing what dukes' wives were never supposed to do, reading her husband's ledgers because she loved the estate and wanted to understand it. She had gone to Grieve's office that harvest night to ask him, gently, plainly, why the numbers did not match. He had smiled at her, cleaned his spectacles, and set fire to the room with her. Still inside it, certain the smoke would take care of the rest. It nearly had. Verena had crawled out through the old servant's passage, half-conscious, her arms scarred forever, and staggered into the dark, not knowing who to trust. Not her husband's steward, not the local constable who took his orders from that same steward, not even, in her fevered fear, her own husband, because how could she know for certain he was not part of it? So she vanished. Marta Quill, her old nurse from the village, took her in and told no one, not even her own son, and nursed her back from the edge of death. For 2 years, Verena Holloway lived as no one. She learned to sew for her bread. She changed her voice, her walk, the way she held her chin. She became Anne Mercer, a quiet woman with clever hands, and she waited because the only way to prove what Grieve had done was to get back inside that house and find the second set of books he must still be keeping. A thief like that never destroys his own arithmetic. He only hides it better. When she heard, through a Leeds seamstress who supplied lace to half the great houses of Yorkshire, that Holloway Court needed a new seamstress for the Duke's second wedding, her hands had trembled so badly, she dropped her needle 3 times before she said yes. Lady Isadora Crane arrived at Holloway Court like weather, sudden, loud, and impossible to argue with. She was 26, beautiful in the sharp way of a well-made knife, and she had wanted to be a duchess since she was old enough to understand what the word meant. She did not love Lucian Holloway. She loved the idea of walking into a ballroom and having every woman in it hate her a little. What she had not expected on her first full day at Holloway Court was a portrait. It hung at the top of the grand staircase, larger than life, a young woman in blue with calm gray eyes and a small private smile, as if she knew a joke nobody else had heard yet. "Who is that?" Isadora asked a footman, though she already knew. "The late Duchess, my lady, Duchess Verena." Isadora stood in front of it for a long time. Then she called for the housekeeper. "Have it taken down," she said. "Burned, if you please. I will not drink my tea under a dead woman's eyes." The housekeeper's face went white. "My lady, His Grace has never permitted." "His Grace," Isadora said, "is about to have a new wife. Take it down." It was Anne Mercer, kneeling in the corner of the room fitting a hem, who was ordered to carry the portrait to the attic herself. Because every other servant in the house had suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, she lifted her own painted face in her own 2 arms and climbed 3 flights of stairs with it, her jaw locked tight, her eyes dry as paper. Behind her, in the hall below, the visiting ladies who had come for the fitting were already whispering. Burn the late Duchess's portrait? Before the wedding has even happened? Poor thing was barely 3 years wed before God took her, and now this. I would not want that woman's jealousy on my conscience, would you? The gossip did not stay in that room. By supper it had traveled through 3 houses in the county, and Lady Isadora Crane's name had already begun to curdle in mouths that had smiled at her that very morning. Upstairs, alone with the portrait in the attic dust, Verena set her own painted face gently against the wall, facing outward, because she could not bear to turn it to the wall like something shameful. She knelt there a long moment. "Not yet," she whispered to the portrait, to herself, to the ghost of the woman she used to be. A little longer. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned fast. Too fast, the reflex of a woman who has learned that footsteps in empty rooms are never nothing. It was only a maid, come to fetch linens. But Verena's heart did not slow for an hour after. 3 days later, at afternoon tea with 4 visiting ladies from Ripon, Isadora's temper found its next victim. A young housemaid named Bess, no older than 16, dropped a tray while adjusting the good china, and a torn thread on the hem of Isadora's new tea gown caught the leg of the table and ripped a full 6 inches. Isadora came out of her chair so fast her teacup shattered on the floor. "Clumsy girl, do you know what this gown cost?" She raised her hand and struck Bess across the face, hard enough that the sound cracked through the whole room. The girl staggered, cheek blooming red, tears springing instantly. The visiting ladies froze mid-sip, cups suspended, eyes wide. "It is the seamstress's fault," Isadora said quickly, seeing the horror on their faces, needing somewhere else to point. Her stitching was loose. Everyone knows Anne Mercer's hems do not hold. It was a lie, and everyone in the sewing room knew it was a lie, because Anne Mercer's work was flawless, precise as clockwork, admired by every lady's maid in the house. But Isadora said it loudly and cruelly in front of witnesses, and Verena, standing quietly in the doorway with a fresh bolt of silk in her arms, simply lowered her eyes and said, "I will mend it at once, my lady," and walked away with her face perfectly calm, and her fists, hidden in the folds of silk, clenched white. One of the Ripon ladies, a Mrs. Fenwick, leaned toward her companion as the seamstress left the room. "She has the patience of a saint," she murmured. "I could not bear to be spoken to that way." "Nor could I," the other whispered back. "That poor woman." It was the second time in a week that Holloway Court's newest mistress had made herself smaller in the eyes of the county, while making its quiet seamstress larger. Isadora did not notice. Jealousy of a dead woman had already begun eating the part of her mind that might have warned her. The first great public gathering came the following week. A formal dinner for 20 of the county's finest families, meant to introduce Lady Isadora properly as the future Duchess of Holloway. Anne Mercer was not meant to be seen at such an event at all. A seamstress belonged below stairs, not among lords and ladies. But a hem tore on Isadora's dinner gown not 20 minutes before the guests arrived. A long, ugly rip along the seam at the shoulder, and there was no time to send for anyone else. Verena was called upstairs at a run, needle already threaded, and told to make the repair while Isadora stood in the gown, in front of her own dressing mirror, with 3 visiting ladies already seated at the table below, waiting to be introduced to her. "Hurry," Isadora snapped, twisting to check the progress in the mirror every few seconds, which only made the work harder. "If you make me late to my own dinner, I will have you dismissed without a reference. Do you understand me?" "Yes, my lady," Verena said, her needle moving fast and sure despite the awkward angle, despite Isadora's constant twisting, despite the older woman's perfume thick enough to choke on. When the last stitch was tied and the thread bitten clean, Isadora did not so much as glance at her. She swept toward the door, and at the threshold she turned back only long enough to say loudly, to no one in particular, "It is remarkable what one must tolerate from the help these days," before disappearing down the stairs to be announced. Verena stood alone in the empty dressing room a moment, her hands, for once, not quite steady. Down below, laughter rose from the dining hall. Genuine, warm laughter, the sound of a house that still knew how to be happy, even if the wrong woman was presiding over it. She thought of the last dinner she had hosted in that very room, 3 years before, seated at Lucian's right hand, before ledgers and lies and fire had taken it all away from her. She did not go down to watch. She returned instead to the small sewing room at the end of the corridor, where a single candle burned, and where, hidden inside the lining of her workbasket, a small book of copied figures waited for her to add one more careful page to it before she went to bed. The dinner ended near midnight. Nobody below stairs ever learned that the seamstress who mended Lady Isidora's gown in 4 rushed minutes had once sat at the head of that very table as its true mistress. Mr. Silas Grieve noticed everything. It was his business to notice everything. 22 years of running an estate's accounts teaches a man to read faces the way he reads figures, for the one column that does not add up. And Anne Mercer's face, calm as a millpond under Isidora's cruelty, did not add up to him. Quiet women who have spent their whole lives sewing for great houses do not carry themselves like that. They do not stand with their spines so straight. They do not meet a duke's eyes for half a second too long before remembering to lower them. Grieve began very quietly to test her. He handed her the wrong key one afternoon, labeled for the linen room, but cut for the old study, the burned room, sealed since the fire, the room where a maid named Grace Tolliver had died wearing another woman's ring. "Fetch me the blue damask from the linen room, if you would, Miss Mercer," he said, holding it out. A seamstress new to the house, given a mislabeled key, would try the wrong door in confusion, perhaps ask a servant for directions, perhaps mention the odd key to someone in passing. Anne Mercer took the key, walked directly and without hesitation to the correct linen room 3 doors down from the study, and returned with the damask inside 4 minutes. She had not needed to be told which door was which. Grieve took his spectacles off and cleaned them slowly on his handkerchief, watching her over the rims. "Efficient," he said. "You know this house well for a woman who arrived only a fortnight ago." "I have a good memory for doors, sir," Verena said. "It is a useful thing in my trade." She smiled, small and pleasant, and left the room, and only when the door closed behind her did she allow her hands to shake. He tried a 3rd trap before the week was out, this one crueler than the last. He mentioned, in passing, over the household ledgers, that the late Duchess had once kept a small dog, a spaniel named Bramble, that had died of grief within a month of her funeral and been buried beneath the old oak by the chapel wall. It was true. It was also a fact known only to 4 people still living in that house, and Grieve watched Anne Mercer's face very carefully as he said it, waiting to see whether grief itself might betray her where caution had not. For half a heartbeat, something moved behind her calm gray eyes, a flicker gone as fast as it came, there and then buried again beneath the same steady composure she wore like armor. "How sad," she said simply, and threaded her needle, and said nothing more. Grieve cleaned his spectacles twice that evening instead of once, which any servant below stairs who knew his habits could have told you meant he was thinking very hard about a lie he had not yet decided how to tell. A week later he tried again, softer this time, almost idle, the way a man asks a question he already suspects the answer to. "Curious hands, Miss Mercer," he said, watching her thread a needle with a speed that came from years, not weeks, of practice. Where did a seamstress learn to read a ledger? He had seen her 3 days before, glancing at the household account book left open on his desk while she waited to be paid for a delivery of thread. Glancing at it for only a second, but a second longer than an innocent eye would have lingered. Verena's needle did not slow. "I do not read ledgers, sir," she said. "I read hymns. A crooked line is the only mathematics I understand." Grieve smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "Of course," he said. "Forgive me." He cleaned his spectacles again as he left the room, and this time Verena understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly what that habit meant. He was not absent-minded. He was a man wiping his hands clean before every lie, and he had just told her one, because she now knew, with certainty, that he suspected her of something. She simply did not yet know that he already knew exactly who she was. It was Lucian who, without meaning to, pushed the story toward its cracking point. 3 weeks before the wedding, unable to sleep, Unable to explain to himself why a seamstress's lullaby had lodged like a splinter in his chest and would not come out, he rode alone to the family vault behind the chapel and ordered the sexton to open his late wife's tomb. "For damp, your grace?" the old sexton asked, confused at midnight, holding a lantern with a shaking hand. "For damp," Lucian said, though it was not damp he was thinking of. He stood in the cold stone chamber as the seal was broken and the coffin lid lifted, and what he saw made him step back so fast he knocked the lantern from the sexton's hand. The wax seal on the coffin had already been broken once before. Recently, cleanly. Someone had opened that coffin before tonight and resealed it clumsily enough that a careful eye, a grieving eye, a husband's eye, could tell. "Who has been here?" Lucian said, very quietly. To the dark, nobody answered him. But somewhere in that house, a steward who kept 2 sets of books felt the temperature of his careful, quiet world begin to drop. Here is where the story turns, and turns hard, because the county, and perhaps you, watching tonight, had already decided who the villain must be. Surely it was Isadora, burning portraits and slapping maids, jealous enough of a dead woman to have arranged her death in advance. It was never Isadora. Isadora was cruel, vain, and small, but she had married a grieving duke for his title 2 years after his wife's death, not before it, and she had never so much as met Verena Holloway in life. The true villain had been standing in plain sight the entire time, cleaning his spectacles, calling women "my lady," in a voice like warm milk, adding numbers in a neat, careful hand that made £31,000 disappear like smoke up a chimney. On the night of the fire 2 years ago, Silas Grieve had stood in the doorway of the Duchess's private study and watched Verena Holloway hold his own forged ledger pages up to the lamp, her face white with the slow, terrible arithmetic of understanding. "Mr. Grieve," she had said, her voice careful, still hoping there was an explanation, still hoping she was wrong. "The wages for the East Farm tenants. There are no tenants at the East Farm. There have been none for 4 years. Where has this money gone?" Grieve had removed his spectacles, cleaned them, put them back on, and smiled at her the way a man smiles at a problem he has already solved. "You should not have come looking, your grace," he said softly, and knocked the oil lamp from the desk with a single sweep of his arm, and closed the study door from the outside, and turned the key, and stood in the corridor listening to the fire catch while a housemaid named Grace Tolliver, who had slipped in moments before to fetch a forgotten shawl, screamed once behind the burning door, and then did not scream again. What Grieve did not know that night, what he only discovered 3 weeks after Anne Mercer arrived at Holloway Court, humming a lullaby that froze a duke in a doorway, was that the woman he thought he had killed had crawled out through the servants' passage while he stood congratulating himself in the smoke, and that she had spent 2 years coming back for him. He had recognized her in truth within her first 4 days in the house, not from her face, which time and hunger and a different way of holding her mouth had changed, but from the particular way she held a pencil when she sketched a pattern tucked between her second and third fingers, exactly as Verena Holloway used to hold hers over a ledger page. He had said nothing. He had simply begun, patiently, to feed her rope, testing her, watching her, waiting to see how much she knew, and who else she might tell before he decided how a second death might be arranged more carefully than the first. The hunter believed himself unhunted. He was wrong. From the evening she arrived, Verena Holloway had been doing exactly what she came to do, searching. She had found, hidden behind a loose stone in the old dairy where the household's second false ledger was kept, 6 months of entries in Grieve's own hand, dated and dry as bone, proof that could hang a man, or at the very least ruin him utterly. She had copied them, at night by candlelight, her burned arm aching, into a small book sewn into the lining of her own work-basket where no housemaid would think to look. And in the village, Marta Quill's cottage grew colder every week. Though the fire in her grate never went out, tended faithfully by a granddaughter who did not understand why the old woman would not see a doctor from town. "I do not need a doctor," Marta told her, gripping the girl's hand with fingers gone thin as bird bones. "I need the vicar. Fetch him tomorrow, not tonight. Tonight I only want to rest." But she did not rest easy. She lay awake instead, thinking of the night 2 years before when a burned, half-drowned young woman had hammered on her door in the dark, whispering a name Marta had not dared say aloud to another living soul since. "You must not tell him yet," Verena had begged her that night, feverish, her arm wrapped in strips torn from Marta's own apron. "Not until I have proof. If I go to Lucian with nothing but my word, and Grieve controls every account in that house, they will call me mad, or worse. They will call me dead and bury me twice." Marta had kept that promise for 2 years. Through every market day whisper about the poor grieving Duke, through every Sunday sermon that mentioned the tragedy at Holloway Court, biting her tongue bloody rather than break her word to the girl she had nursed since infancy. Now, with her own strength running out faster than she had admitted even to herself, Marta feared dying with the truth locked inside her chest where it could do no good to anyone living. When the vicar came the next morning, she gripped his sleeve with more strength than her thin body seemed to hold. "Write down every word I say," she told him, "and do not soften a single one of them for my sake or anyone else's." Propped against 3 pillows in a cold cottage bedroom, her breath rattling but her voice clear, Marta Quill dictated the truth of the Holloway fire from beginning to end. The hammering at her door, the burned arm, the whispered name of Silas Grieve, the 2 long years of hiding. While the vicar's pen scratched steadily across the page and her granddaughter wept quietly by the window. "Seal it," Marta said when it was finished, "and give it to no one but a magistrate. Not the Duke first, a magistrate, so no one grieving can be talked out of believing it." She signed her name at the bottom in a hand that shook so badly the letters barely held together, and dying slowly of a weak heart she had refused to speak of until her strength was nearly gone, she had given the clergyman a sworn letter, signed with that trembling hand, sealed, and delivered into his keeping with instructions to carry it to no one but a magistrate, and only if Marta herself did not survive to speak it in person. Every scene in that house now was a knife fight fought in polite voices. Grieve tested Verena with small traps disguised as kindness. Verena answered each one with the flat, practiced calm of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to lie without moving a single muscle of her face. At supper below stairs, Grieve remarked, apparently idly, that the late Duchess had always taken her tea with a slice of lemon, never sugar, a small detail, nowhere written down, known only to the household of 5 years past. He watched Anne Mercer's face as he said it. She did not so much as glance up from her needle. "How fortunate for her," she said pleasantly. "I take mine with sugar myself." Grieve smiled and said nothing more. But that night he wrote a letter to a man in Leeds, an old associate from the days when he first began moving money through a false account, asking, in careful and roundabout language, whether certain funds might need to be moved again, quickly, and further this time. A young under-clerk named Peters, hired only that autumn and eager to prove himself useful, found the letter half burned in the study grate the next morning while raking out the ashes for the housemaids, and being a curious and conscientious boy, smoothed the singed corner flat against his knee and read enough of it to understand that something in it did not sit right. Words like "move the funds further this time" and "before the wedding," "to be safe," did not belong in any innocent letter he could imagine. He folded it carefully into his jacket and set off down the corridor at a near run, meaning to put it directly into the Duke's own hands. He did not get further than the second landing. Peters, Grieve's voice, pleasant as ever, stopped the boy cold at the top of the stairs. "You look as though you have found treasure. What is it?" Peters, flustered, still young enough to believe that a kind voice meant a kind heart, held the scrap out without thinking twice. "Found it in the grate, sir. Thought it looked queer. meant to show his grace. Grieve took it from him, turned it over once in the light as though merely curious, and smiled the warm, careful smile that had fooled cleverer people than one eager underclerk. "Very diligent of you," he said. "This is nothing but an old note of mine regarding coal deliveries, half burned by accident. I shall save His Grace the trouble, and file it myself." He slipped it into his waistcoat pocket before Peters had finished nodding, and clapped the boy once on the shoulder, and walked on down the stairs, as though nothing in the world troubled him. It was the closest the truth had come to daylight in 2 years, and it had come within one clumsy, well-meaning boy's good intentions of ending the whole scheme 3 weeks early. Grieve did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his own small office with the shutters drawn, burning every remaining scrap of correspondence he owned in his own grate long after the rest of the house had gone dark, and cleaned his spectacles 17 times before he managed, near dawn, to close his eyes at all. A careful man faced for the first time in 6 years with the real possibility of discovery does not become less dangerous. He becomes more so, the way a cornered animal becomes more dangerous the instant its den is threatened. And it was that same restless night, staring at his own dying fire, that Silas Grieve first began to plan exactly what he would do to Anne Mercer before she could finish whatever it was she had clearly come to Holloway Court to do. Small justices kept arriving anyway, the way rain finds every crack in a roof before the real storm comes. At the county horse fair, Isadora, determined to outshine the memory of a woman she had never met, had ordered a new carriage on credit against the estate's name without her husband's knowledge. Money Grieve had quietly, gleefully allowed to be spent, since a spendthrift bride made fine cover for a spendthrift steward. When the bill came due before the wedding and Lucian, going over the accounts himself for the first time in a year, found the sum, he was cold with Isadora for 3 full days, and the servants below stairs, who had watched her burn a dead woman's portrait and strike a 16-year-old girl across the face, allowed themselves quietly, in the scullery, over the washing up, a small private satisfaction that did nobody any harm and cost the story nothing but a little of Isadora's pride. Grieve's own forged page, the one Peters had nearly carried upstairs, sat burning a hole in his conscience for a week, a mistake he could not undo, a mistake that Verena, watching everything, missing nothing, the way she had missed nothing for 2 long, hungry, hidden years, noted and folded away for later use like a card kept up a sleeve. The wedding was set for a Saturday in late January, and the eve of it, the great pre-wedding ball, the last and largest gathering the county would see before Isadora Crane became a duchess, was to be held in the great hall of Holloway Court itself. Every family of standing in 3 counties invited, the same hall where 2 years before a maid had died, wearing a dead woman's ring, and where, 3 weeks earlier, a seamstress had hummed 4 notes that stopped a grieving man's heart in his chest. The second great public gathering of the county came 10 days before the wedding. A winter charity bazaar held in the long gallery of Holloway Court, tables of donated goods and needlework laid out for the poor of the parish, half the county's ladies in attendance, with their husbands trailing behind them holding parcels. Isadora, determined to be seen as generous as well as beautiful before her wedding, had insisted that Anne Mercer's finest embroidery be displayed and sold under Isadora's own name, the proceeds credited to Isadora's charity, though every stitch and every piece had come from Verena's own hands, working late into the night for weeks. A visiting baroness admired one piece in particular, a christening gown worked with tiny fern leaves along the hem. Verena's own private joke, stitched into the linen where only she would ever know its meaning, and asked Isadora directly, "Your work, my lady? It is extraordinary." Isadora did not hesitate. "Mine, yes," she said, smiling prettily, accepting the baroness's compliments as though the needle had never left her own soft hand. Verena, standing 3 feet away, arranging a table of donated linens, said nothing, though her jaw tightened for exactly 1 second before the calm settled back over her face like a curtain falling. It was, in the end, a small and almost private justice, but a sweet one. The Baroness, delighted with the christening gown, insisted on paying double its asking price and asked that a note be sent thanking the maker personally. Isadora, cornered, was forced to write a thank you note in her own hand to the talented Miss Mercer, a note Verena kept folded in her work-basket for weeks afterward, a small strange trophy, proof, worthless in a courtroom but priceless to her own heart, that even a woman trying to erase her could not quite manage to do it. That evening, over supper below stairs, one of the older housemaids muttered into her soup that Lady Isadora had a rare talent for taking credit and an even rarer one for taking blame. And the whole servants' table laughed quietly into their bowls, careful not to be overheard, and for a moment it felt almost like justice, though the real reckoning was still 3 weeks away. Grieve struck first. He had spent 2 years hiding, and hiding men grow desperate faster than hunted ones expect. And desperation in a careful man looks exactly like courage. He had decided in the last days before the wedding that the only way to silence Anne Mercer before she could speak was to destroy her credibility so completely, so publicly, that nothing she said afterward could ever be believed by anyone in that county again. He knew where she kept her work-basket. He knew, from watching her for weeks, that she wore something small and gold on a chain beneath her collar most days, tucked out of sight, a ring, he suspected, though he had never seen it clearly, and it did not matter what it truly was, because a story only needs to be believed for as long as it takes to ruin a person. 2 nights before the ball, he slipped into her small attic room while she was below stairs at supper, took the ring from where it lay in a locked drawer, he forced with a thin blade, and hid it inside his own coat, ready. The wedding eve ball filled Holloway Court to its very rafters. Every family of standing in 3 counties had come, earls and baronets, their wives dripping diamonds, their daughters hoping to be noticed, their sons hoping to be fed. Candles blazed in every sconce until the great hall shimmered like the inside of a lantern. The orchestra played in the gallery above. Silk and jewels moved through the room like a river of light finding its way downhill. Long tables groaned under silver and hothouse. Flowers shipped up from London at a cost that would have fed the East Farm tenants for a year, back when the East Farm tenants still existed only on paper in a dead thief's careful hand. Isadora, radiant in white and diamond, stood at the center of it all, one gloved hand resting on Lucian's arm, playing at last the role she had wanted her whole life, a duchess, or near enough to one that the difference no longer seemed to matter to her. Anne Mercer stood near the wall in her plain gray dress, among the other servants, brought up to assist with cloaks and shawls, invisible in the way the county had always found convenient. She had spent that afternoon finishing the last alterations to Isadora's wedding gown itself, hanging now upstairs for the morning, every stitch in it perfect, every seam sewn by hands that had once worn a duchess's own rings at a ball very like this one. She watched the dancers turn beneath the candlelight and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something close to peace, because by morning, one way or another, the waiting would be finished. It did not stay peaceful long. And into the middle of that glittering crowd, just as the first dance was called and the orchestra lifted into its opening bars, Silas Grieve walked forward with 2 footmen at his side and pointed a steady finger across the room. "Seize her," he said, loud enough to carry over the music which stumbled and died. "That woman, the seamstress, is a thief. I found the late Duchess's ring, stolen from this house, hidden among her things not 1 hour ago." The music stopped entirely. 300 guests turned as one. The footman, confused but obedient, closed on Verena where she stood quietly near the wall in her plain gray dress, and one of them seized her by the arm, the burned arm, hard enough that she gasped. A woman near the punch table screamed. Fans stopped moving. Somewhere a glass slipped from a hand and shattered on the marble floor, the sound sharp and final in the frozen silence. Isadora's mouth fell open. Lucian went white as the tablecloths, one hand flying instinctively toward Verena before he caught himself, confused by his own reaction, not yet understanding why his whole body had moved to protect a seamstress he barely knew. "Bring her forward," Grieve called, his voice rich with false authority, holding the gold ring aloft, where every candle in the hall caught it and threw its glitter across 300 upturned faces. "Let the county see the thief who has been living under this roof, pretending humility while she robbed a dead woman's grave of her own wedding ring." Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Whispers rose and died and rose again. A seamstress, stealing from the dead. I always said there was something strange about that quiet one. Poor Lady Isadora, what a scandal on her own wedding eve. Verena Holloway lifted her chin, and the two footmen holding her arms felt her stop straining against them, felt her go still and steady as stone, and something in that stillness made even Grieve's confident smile falter half an inch. "Mr. Grieve," she said, and her voice, though not loud, carried clean across the whole silent hall the way a single struck bell carries over a sleeping town. "You have shown the county a ring. Shall I show them your books instead?" The hall did not breathe. "The false wages paid to tenants who do not exist at the East Farm," Verena said, her eyes never leaving his face, "dated the 4th of every month, going back 6 years in your own hand. The second key to the record room, cut without His Grace's knowledge, which you have carried on your own watch chain since the spring of 1904. £31,000, moved through an account in Leeds under the name Samuel Grieve. Your own brother's name, Mr. Grieve, borrowed because you did not have the courage to steal in your own." Grieve's face had gone the color of ash. His hand moved toward his spectacles from pure habit and stopped halfway, trembling. "You lie," he said, but his voice cracked on the second word, and 300 people heard it crack. "You buried an empty coffin, Mr. Grieve," Verena said, and now she pulled her arm free of the footman's slackened grip and reached up and began very slowly to unpin her hair and to sing, not hum this time, but sing clear and unhurried, the 4 notes and then the 4 notes after them, the lullaby that only one living woman on earth had ever known, while with her other hand she pulled back the sleeve of her gray dress to bare the fern-shaped scar on her right forearm to every candle-lit face in that vast room. "Tonight," she said, over the sound of 300 people forgetting how to breathe, "we open your books instead." A woman near the door screamed and did not stop. Another fainted straight into her husband's arms, her fan clattering to the floor. Lucian Holloway made a sound that was not quite a word and crossed the entire length of that ballroom in perhaps 6 strides, guests scrambling out of his path, and fell to his knees in front of her, a duke, on his knees before his whole assembled county, and said her name, her real name, for the first time in 2 years. Verena. Just that. Her name breaking in half in his mouth. Isadora Crane stood frozen at the center of the room in her white and diamond, the bride of tomorrow, suddenly the least important person in it, and then she began to shriek, not from grief but from a fury so total it needed somewhere to go. "This cannot be. This is not possible. Someone tell me this is not happening to me." Her voice rising over the chaos like a kettle boiling dry, and nobody in that entire hall spared her more than half a glance, because every eye, every single eye, was fixed on the seamstress who was not a seamstress, kneeling now in front of a duke who was weeping openly in front of 300 witnesses and did not care who saw it. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened at that exact moment, cold January air pouring in with them, and the county magistrate walked in with 2 constables at his back and a sealed letter in his gloved hand. "Mr. Silas Grieve," he called, his voice carrying easily now that the room had gone deathly quiet to hear it. "I have here a sworn testimony from one Marta Quill of this parish, witnessed and signed before her clergyman 3 days before her death, concerning the fire at Holloway Court and the theft of £31,000 from this estate. I am placing you under arrest." Greaves' spectacles slipped from his shaking hand and shattered on the marble floor, the same floor where a glass had shattered minutes before. The same sound, an echo the whole hall seemed to feel in its teeth. He looked around at 300 faces that had, only an hour before, been smiling at him over champagne, and found not one friend among them. The footman who had seized Verena Holloway on his order now seized him instead, at his own gesture, marching him past the very same guests who had gasped at his accusation minutes earlier. The same crowd, the same candles, the same hall, only now the finger pointed the other way. He had called her a thief in front of the county. Now the county watched him dragged out as one. Lucian rose from his knees, took the ring, the real ring, Verena's own wedding ring, recovered from Greaves' coat by the constables before he was marched away, and slid it back onto her hand himself. There on the ballroom floor, in front of every soul in 3 counties who had come to watch him marry someone else the following morning. "This," he said, his voice shaking, loud enough that even the weeping, furious Isadora at the edge of the room heard every word, "is my wife. She has always been my wife." Nobody in that hall so much as whispered a disagreement. It took 3 days for the county to finish talking about it, and longer than that for Holloway Court itself to grow quiet again. Silas Greaves was tried at the spring assizes and sentenced to 14 years. His neat handwriting and his careful ledgers laid out before a jury as the plainest confession any thief ever wrote against himself without meaning to. The prosecutor read his own forged entries aloud in open court, in his own careful hand, for the East Farm tenants who had never existed. The same trick, the mirror image of the very thing he had done to Verena 2 years before. His own numbers used to convict him just as her arithmetic had unmasked him at the ball. He had accused a seamstress of theft before 300 witnesses. Now he stood accused of theft before 12 jurors in a public gallery. And this time there was no clerk he could silence, no boy's discovery he could pocket before it reached the wrong ears. When the verdict was read, he reached, from pure old habit, for the spectacles that had been taken from him at the courthouse door, and found only air, and had nothing left to clean and nothing left to hide behind. The £31,000, or what remained of it after the Leeds account was seized, was returned to the estate, and the tenants of the East Farm, the real ones, who had gone unpaid and half forgotten for years, while Greaves' fictions drew their wages instead, were made whole at last, with the Duke himself riding out to each cottage to apologize in person, hat in hand, for what his own steward had stolen from them under his very nose while he was too deep in his own grief to notice. Lady Isadora Crane left Holloway Court within the week. Her engagement ended before it could properly begin. Her name attached forever after in every drawing room in Yorkshire to the ball where she had shrieked over a diamond, while a duke wept over his living wife. The same visiting ladies who had once whispered admiration for her generosity at the charity bazaar, now whispered something far less kind whenever her name came up over tea, and there was no seamstress left in that story for her to blame it on. She married, eventually, a baronet 2 counties over, a smaller house and a smaller life than the one she had schemed for, and if there is any mercy in this story for her, it is only that nobody ever again asked her to explain what happened that January night at Holloway Court, because everybody already knew. Marta Quill did not live to see the trial, but she lived long enough to hear, from her granddaughter, that a magistrate and 2 constables had ridden out from Holloway Court itself, hats removed, to thank her in person for the letter that had saved a duchess and convicted a thief, and she died 3 weeks later, with that knowledge folded quietly against her heart, at peace in a way she had not been in 2 long years. Verena had her nurse's grave moved at her own expense into the Holloway family plot itself, an honor no servant of the parish had ever been given before or since, and had the stone cut with words she chose herself. She kept the truth safe until it was ready to be told. Every year afterward, on the date of Marta's death, fresh flowers appeared on that grave before anyone else in the household had risen for breakfast, and nobody ever needed to ask who had placed them there. Verena Holloway, no longer Ann Mercer, no longer a woman hiding in an attic room with a needle and a secret, took up residence again in the rooms that had once been hers, and the portrait that had been carried to the attic in her own 2 arms was carried back down by 4 footmen and hung once more at the top of the grand staircase, where it has stayed ever since. She had her burned arm looked at properly for the first time in 2 years by a physician from York, who told her, gently, that the scar would never fully fade, and she told him, just as gently, that she had stopped wishing it would. The confession between husband and wife did not happen in the ballroom, in front of the county, with the orchestra silent and the candles guttering. It happened 3 nights later, quietly, in the small parlor where she used to take her tea before the fire that was never truly a fire at all but a murder dressed up as an accident. "I should have fought harder for what we had before you vanished," Lucien said, turning his glass slowly in his hands, not able yet to look at her directly. "I told myself I was grieving. Some part of me, Verena, simply believed you were dead and let myself believe it, because it was easier than facing what our marriage had become before that. I neglected you. I let a steward run this house while I rode and hunted, and told myself that was a husband's business. You found what I should have found myself years before you did." Verena set down her own cup. "I stayed hidden 3 months longer than I needed to," she said quietly. "I had the proof by autumn. I could have come to you in October. I told myself I needed to be certain. Some part of me, Lucien, was also afraid of what I would find when I came back, whether there would be anything left here worth returning to." He looked up at her then, and neither of them reached for the other yet, and that, too, felt honest. 2 people who had both failed each other a little, sitting in the same quiet room, leaving the door between them open rather than forcing it shut too fast. "I do not expect you to simply become my wife again overnight, as though 2 years were a season away visiting relatives," Lucien said. "I do not know how to court a woman I already married once and already buried once. I only know I do not want to fail you a second time by rushing what should be rebuilt slowly." Verena almost smiled, the first real smile she had allowed herself inside those walls, since the night she hummed a lullaby over a hymn and watched a duke's face go white in a doorway. "That," she said, "is the first sensible thing you have said to me since I came back from the dead. Perhaps start there. Ask me to walk in the garden tomorrow, the way you used to, before either of us knew what a ledger could cost a person." "Will you come?" he asked, and there was something almost boyish in the question, something of the man she had married before grief and theft and fire had aged them both past their years. "I will come," she said. "Slowly is not the same as never, Lucien. I did not survive 2 years hiding in an attic to spend the rest of my life keeping my distance from my own front door." It was enough, for that night, simply to leave the door open, and to know, both of them, that this time it would stay open. In the weeks that followed, Holloway Court began slowly to remember how to be a happy house again. Verena took up her old rooms and her old name, and eventually her old place at the head of the very dinner table where Isadora had once ordered a portrait burned rather than share the room with a dead woman's painted eyes. The staff who had watched her carry her own likeness to the attic, with steady hands, now watched her direct footmen and approve menus with the same steadiness, and if anyone below stairs still called her, out of old habit, Miss Mercer, by mistake now and then, she only smiled and let it pass, because a woman who has survived what she survived does not need a house full of servants to remind her who she truly is. The dead, it turns out, keep excellent records, better, in the end, than the living ever expect them to. So we leave it to you tonight to decide the harder question. Duke Lucian Holloway's only true crime was believing his wife dead too easily and grieving instead of searching. Some would call that an unforgivable failure of faith in the person he loved most. Others would call it simple, human grief, doing exactly what grief does to every person it touches. Could you forgive a husband whose only crime was believing you were dead too easily? Tell us which side of that question you stand on. This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.